Hi everyone, and good afternoon, good evening, and thanks Ashwini for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts on this. And I hope you had a great day. I had seen at the agenda, and I thought it was a power-packed agenda. I had a tight day and I could not attend it, so my apologies. But I'm happy to share some thoughts that at least have been resonating for the last several months. I'm sure all of us are, as somebody said, we are not. This is a time when we are not in the same boat, but we are in the same storm. So we are actually riding the same storm. So I'm sure all of us can associate with that. The topic of my talk is business anti-fragility, the new normal. But I just want to give a little spin to that by calling it a little the new abnormal. The reason why I'm saying that is that when we say a new normal, we actually expect that there is some sense of that this is a normal A, and we are going to settle down at normal B. So there is a notion of settling down and establishing a new normal. But I think the mental model that we need to have is that there is no such thing as a stable platform anymore. The new normal is going to be volatility and turbulence. We just have to get used to that. And I think that's a more powerful mental model in my view. So, how do we live in that world? And that is really going to be our individual and collective challenges that I want to talk in next half an hour. By way of introduction, I work at Walmart Labs. I head the strategy and operations over there. I'm also doing my PhD at this point in time from ISB Hyderabad. So those are the two things that keep me busy. So with that, let me get started here and talk a little bit about something that I think might be very relevant to most of us, if not all. These are my personal views, so got nothing to do with my employer. Let's just set the context based on what we know about business agility, right? And if we see what does it really mean for an organization to display business agility, we typically say these are the four things that they talk about, which is in terms of quick adaptation to the market changes. So we say these are companies that can very quickly adapt to those changes. They respond flexibly to the customer. So it is not just the speed, but it is also the ability to kind of find what is a customer need and then respond accordingly. Maintain the quality at a cost effective level. I think that's an important part of it because that's a table stake. That's not something that goes away. That still has to be there. And finally, make sure that we still sustain the competitive advantage. So that is one of the, and I'm sure you'll find a lot of definitions with no one single being the absolute right one, but it is kind of in that direction there. So that's how we are typically at this point in time describing business agility. And if I look at how is the situation in the industry today, how do we look at that? So I was looking at the business agility report 2019. The 21 doesn't seem to be out, but if I look at 20, it seems to show that while there are challenges, that we are doing it, even though the current maturity is relatively low, but we seem to be probably having a little bit of a traction there, increased revenue, market share, faster turnaround times, improved relationship with the customers, greater transparency, employee engagement. So all the indicators seem to be going in the right direction there, right? So that's one sense of what I get out of it. And how do we really make sure that it happens? Some of the predictive behaviors that the report found out was that there are these three predictive indicators seem to be the key: funding models, value streams, and relentless improvement. So that seems to be very positively correlated with the business agility there. But that notwithstanding, we still seem to have a big concern because the overall scorecard looks pretty shameful, because we are only at 4.4, which is not even what is in the walking maturity, which is in walking. And the accepted in the Business Agility Institute is that at least we should have 7, and then we will consider the general company as business agile, and 79% of them are actually less than 7. So it clearly is a concern there. So on one hand, we are using a lot of methods and frameworks and tools and what have you in the name of business agility. But when we look at the business agility score itself, we see a disconnect. So there is clearly a lot of ground to cover there. Meanwhile, not a news to anybody, the COVID-19 continues unabated. If you see, this is from the WHO chart, which is yesterday night's chart. This is a weekly chart, so the number of cases weekly on a weekly basis, on a daily basis added on a weekly accumulate, and we are still not seeing a peak of the curve. The last two complete weeks do seem like that they might be at the same level, so maybe the peak is very close by, and these are the global numbers. But then you can imagine, it is anybody's guess whether it will take another 3 months before we come back to the normal or not. So it's still anybody's guess there. Meanwhile, what is happening is the impact of COVID has been unprecedented. We have never seen anything like this before in our living memories for the last three generations, probably. We have established brands like Cirque du Soleil. I mean, they redefined circus, right? They shut down, or that they. So most of these companies have either shut down, or they have laid off a huge number of people, or they have filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. I mean, brands like Excite Technologies probably has been about 100 years old, or Gold's Gym or Hertz, for example, such iconic brands. Intelsat, the company that launched the first commercial satellite, or JC Penney. So these are the companies that have really been going through a lot of tough time, and the list continues to grow. And even the new age companies have not been unaffected by that, right? I mean, there are all kind of things going on. For example, in case of a WeWork, of course, there were other questions that were coming from the IPO side of it. But even then, I mean, looking at this graph alone with Masayoshi Son standing there, it's such a stark message that goes out. And this particular article that came out from Brian Chesky, the Airbnb CEO, he said, it took us 12 years to build and we lost everything in 6 weeks. So I think these are like, and these companies were supposed to have the asset light, hyper agile model, where all you were doing was basically removing the transaction cost in the system and creating a very frictionless marketplace. So no asset value being carried on your books. And with like tons and tons of funding there, and they have not really been able to withstand this storm there. If they cannot do it, most common companies probably have struggled to do that. And at an individual level, the struggle has been high, because whether it is in globally or in India, there is all kind of impact happening there. If you see the economic impact, it's been an amazing. I mean, majority of the countries are on the brink of recession. You look at this graph where I'm pointing the mouse right now. The U.S. economic growth for the last 3 years, every quarter, it's like everything was like positive 2%, 3%, 4%, and then suddenly we have minus 32%, right? Just wiped out the whole, or decimated the entire financial systems there. So obviously, this is a huge concern for all the companies there and all the individuals there. Now, there are some bright spots also, which are the companies that are riding the same storm, but they have been able to actually do relatively better, so to say. For example, there are companies like in the US, and there are companies in India that are basically doing some of these activities better than that, because either they have been able to pivot their business model and offerings to basically align with what is needed during the COVID. Of course, we still have to see what will happen in the post-COVID situation, because not every pivot may be relevant for the post-COVID scenario, but nevertheless, they are still riding the same storm, and they have still been able to kind of build something around what is really needed at this point in time. So, and then a full recovery might still be many years. I mean, if we really see, what is happening is, the full recovery is being projected. This is a McKinsey article that came out a month back, and they are saying if it's a muted recovery, it is actually about 4 to 5 years away. And that's the kind of a scenario that they are painting for the levels to return to the pre-COVID. So whether it is if somebody is in arts and entertainment and recreation, like nobody's going and watching movie right now, even if there is a play going on, and things like that. And for example, the hotel revenues per available room are expected to be down for next 2 years, and they are only going to be at the same levels by 2023. So clearly a lot has to be done there. So that begs some critical questions like, is being agile enough? And when I'm saying agile, I'm not just saying from the context of agile manifesto or agile frameworks. I'm saying in general, is just being agile an enough compelling idea? Or is business agility as we understand a good enough thing? or could it be that is it actually making the businesses fragile? Because while we are doing all the things there, what is happening is the moment there is a rare event, as we call it in the parlance of like Nicholas Taleb, for example, he calls it as black swan events or rare events. While as long as it is a stable platform, everything looks fine. We are able to do the right thing. But the moment there is this big thing comes, the whole thing shatters and more everything collapses there. That seems to be the pattern based on what we are seeing here. So I call it as the new abnormal, and I think even though it is not really new, if you really see, right, for the last 20 years, from a dot-com boom and then the meltdown to 9/11 to SARS and Hurricane Katrina and 2008 global financial meltdown, and in India also we have seen other flavors of that, right? Whether it is a GST demonetization, everything has had an impact on people's normal, and it kept changing there all the time. So if you look at old normal, we used to call it as a term as business as usual, right? And I don't want to even call the new normal as a business as usual. I want to call the new abnormal will be turbulence as usual, because it's going to be always changing. We have to change our mental models of how we are going to look at it. There's no notion of stability or finality or equilibrium or a steady state. We are going to continue to have to deal with multiple moving parts, and if we cannot really make sense out of the whole thing there, we will get frustrated, while others who are smarter in terms of understanding a complex system, they will be able to do that. Agility is a table stake. It will be needed, but it's not enough. It's necessary, but not sufficient condition there. What we need is really some kind of anti-fragility in the system here. So what is it? Let me illustrate you with an example there, right? Even though a lot of us don't have the concept of the Thanksgiving turkey, but imagine that you are a turkey, and you don't know, obviously, when you are a turkey, you don't know what is Thanksgiving. So what happens to you is that you have your human operator, you have your human helper who is basically feeding you, and your mental model is that, oh, this human being is such a nice guy. He comes every day, he takes care of you, he feeds you, and he gives you a bath, he pats you, everything happens. For 1000 days this keeps happening, but on 1001st day something strange happens there. He comes there and he gives you a big surprise there, and that surprise turns you into the Thanksgiving turkey, right? You become a lunch there for somebody, and for you, you don't even know what has hit you. Obviously you are not there anymore to appreciate or think about it, but this is a scenario that happens there. So when you are the turkey, you are assuming that every single day is actually an extrapolation of the last day and the day before and the week before, and that continues forever. But one day it happens that the whole thing just comes as a big surprise, and you cannot kind of do that. Now, Nicholas Taleb calls these kind of events as a black swan event, and the whole reference to black swan is basically that until 18th century, the mental model in Europe was that the swans are white, because nobody had seen black swan, because in some sense they had not kind of discovered Australia. And when they went to Australia, they found that you have black swans there, and that's the reason it was a very rare kind of an event, and that's how the term came, and the name of his book there. And it's essentially now being used to talk about the events that are an outlier and prospectively unpredictable, even though in retrospectively we are able to explain them, that we are able to say, hey, this is how it probably happened there. I mean, today anyone can come back and say, hey, I think it's not a surprise why the global financial meltdown happened, or even COVID happened, right? But prospectively, that is, if you go behind time and say in 3 months something like COVID is going to happen, can you actually predict that? I don't think anybody has that ability to do that. And plus it has a very high consequence or impact collectively there. So these are black swan events that happen there. Now, black swan events affect things in a way that they become very fragile, because they just shatter and they collapse there. And on the other end, the challenge for us is that doesn't really help us, because the black swans keep happening there. They are just happening from different angles and different side. What is really the solution for us? So what Nicholas Taleb said, that there are some things that benefit from shocks. Now, most of the time we think of things that are fragile and he says like a flower vase, for example, if you drop it on the floor, it shatters. And then there might be things that are resisting those kind of shocks, right? Like if you have a block of iron and you drop it, well, nothing's going to happen there because it's strong enough to be resilient to that. But then there is a third category of things which he calls as anti-fragile, and he says there is no word in the English language for that. These are the things that not only resist it but actually benefit from that. And if you think of it from this mighty mouse, I mean, like our muscular system, for example, the more you actually pull, like lift weights, for example, the more the muscles develop. And that is a great example of anti-fragility actually. The same way our immunity system is the same thing. That, for example, I was just telling somebody today, some of you probably know that I spent 16 months in Antarctica. And Antarctica is a place where there is no virus or bacteria. Hopefully there is no COVID as well there. And then what happened was we were living in such pristine environment where there was no bacteria or virus, and we were so strong and hale and hearty. Everything was good there, right? But we didn't realize that was actually a hollow kind of a health, because our immunity levels kept going down, unbeknownst to us. And then the moment the new team came, and we were so happy that we hugged them and all, and immediately they transmitted their cold and flu viruses, and we were sneezing and just coughing all the time there. So this is how basically the whole thing is, that we think that by protecting ourselves we become stronger. Actually the body and the systems behave in a different way. We actually become fragile by doing it. So Nicholas Taleb talks about the fact that we need to become more anti-fragile. We need to really be in a system where we not only can resist but actually benefit from those shocks there. And that's his book all about basically. So I want to basically talk, and that's the whole idea there. He actually gives the whole thing from mythology. He says, like the sword of Damocles. Damocles told his king, hey, you have such an easy life. Why don't I think it's a great thing? And he says, oh, you think it's a great life? Why don't you become a king? So he became a king for a day, but he saw, and he was enjoying being a king. But then he saw that there was this sword hanging over him with a very small, very tiny thread. And that was the so-called sword of Damocles, right? If it breaks, then the whole thing goes away, right? It looks good, but then there is always that super weak point. Or the mythological bird phoenix, that when it gets burned, it rises from its ashes. Now, we won't call it as anti-fragile, but we call it as resilient, for the simple idea that every time it becomes exactly the same thing. So while it comes back from that shock, it is not really benefiting from that shock. On the other hand, the Greek mythological animal Hydra basically had this property that if you chop off one head, it grows two heads there. So when Hercules was fighting it, he had to find a way, because every time he would cut off the head, two more will grow. Now some people might say that in our own mythology Ravan was like that, but Ravan is more like resilient, because Ravan did not like grow many heads. If you chopped off one head, one more came in place of that, not two. So just a subtle distinction here. So that said, now what does it really mean? What can we do? How can we really become more anti-fragile? Now, just as you can see in this graph, the below here is fragile, which just performance goes down. The blue one is resilient, so there might be a temporary dip in the performance, and then it comes back to the same level. In case of anti-fragile, also there might be a smaller dip, but then it actually comes out of that dip and is able to actually build a higher performance there. So how can we do that? How can we build a business that will be more anti-fragile there? I just want to share some ideas here. So the first thing that I think is important to understand is that the shock itself has an impact. It has an energy. It is some kind of a direction that is coming there. And if you try to fight it, I think in my view, it is not the best strategy, because that energy itself can be harnessed. So for example, those of you who might be judokas here, or those who practice Aikido form of judo or martial arts, Aikido is actually a martial art which actually says that even a tiny person can actually fight a big guy. And the way that happens is that you typically don't resist energy with another energy, but you actually channelize the energy. So somebody is coming running at you, you basically don't stop it, but you take that energy and you kind of throw the person away. So even the very tiny people who don't probably have a lot of energy can actually make people flip in the air and make them fall and all. So I'm not talking about physical strength here, I'm talking about the mental model, that how do you really, you don't really start fighting, you really start harnessing that energy. So that's the first thing to me. Then I think as this guy Ram, this person said, that it would be a shame to waste a crisis, right? I mean, if we try to waste a crisis, that's not really helpful. When we talk about the whole notion of anti-fragility, we are talking about subjecting a lot of shocks to the system. So if you look at this chart, which talks about the global airline traffic in the last 20 years, even though today we standing here, we now say that, hey, the whole airline industry is going through a rough time. But if you see in the last 20 years, .com was the time and 9/11 was the time when it took about 6 years for it to come out of it. And right after that, the SARS and all those things happened. But if you see, on an average, airline industry is one industry that has continued to become anti-fragile. It continues to grow strength to strength after every such kind of a shock impact there. Even though it may not be apparent to us looking at it in a small time window, when you see the big window, you can actually see that. So if airlines industry cannot come out of it, maybe others will find it difficult there, right? So it's a great example of how they have been exploiting every kind of crisis, whether it is if you remember this particular volcanic eruption that happened in Iceland, which actually stalled the whole travel for multiple months in Europe, even that, after that, again, it continued to grow there. So I think that's a great example of using every small crisis to basically say, hey, how can we do it better, and keep building on top of that. Then I think when we look at strategy, a lot of times organizations and us, we don't always look at strategy as something that's a very comprehensive and an elegant way of doing it. The chart that I'm showing you is actually what Walt Disney created as their strategy map back in 1957, and it was revised in 67, but this one I'm using is the original one. Now, if you see here, even like 50 years back or 60 years back, it was very clear to Disney how they are really going to build a very intricate web of things there. So for example, merchandising and Disneyland. Now today Disneylands are not accessible because nobody is going because of social distancing. But Disney has been able to build so many other assets in their portfolio that together with Disney Group, they are anti-fragile. So now you see Disney and Hotstar have come together. The Marvel Studios is going there all the time there. When I do a search on that, even Tata Sky shows has something to do with Disney. So maybe they have some kind of an agreement on that. So they have been able to build such a nice collection or some kind of a necklace of pearls, so to say, strategy, that even if one or two is down in that, overall they are so anti-fragile that they are able to leverage that collectively, and they are able to grow from there. And this is a strategy that has continued for 60 years. It is not something that they have built today. So I think this is a great way to look at it, rather than looking at a monolith, which itself could be like, hey, the moment you have a problem, you have to stop, or you have like all eggs in one basket. That is also a risk there, because they don't really interact with each other. But then you have a situation where you have something like this, which allows you to kind of grow there. So the next thing that I would briefly talk about is the digital business models. There's a lot of focus and emphasis on digital there. And today, if you see, for example, I was talking to somebody, one of the startups yesterday, and they have been in they're in the space where they're helping a lot of companies in the retail space. And they said 6 years back when we started, we anyway started as digital. Everything was digital. Our supply, our sales process was digital. Our service delivery was digital. I was asking them, do you kind of actually go and do any on-prem? They said, we do have an on-prem version, but really we have been born on cloud from day one there. And that's really been the whole model there. So I think it's inevitable to think from that point of view and say, well, how do you really take care of these kind of disruptions that may have something to do with travel or location or physical proximity? If that is going to be a single big risk, then obviously digital is a way to kind of look at that. So that is definitely one thing to look at it. Few other pointers there, I think in general as a mental model, I would say is, a lot of times businesses run away from uncertainty and they say, hey, this is not very clear, I don't want to touch that area. But I think that's exactly the point with being anti-fragile, that we are looking at really how can we work on some of the new areas. We have not worked on them, and I'll talk a little more about the new area concept, how to pick those new areas in a few slides from now. Second is accept a little bit of a risk in the projects. It is exactly like what should I say? This is something that used to happen in 60s in the US. There was this whole concept of chickenpox party, and I would certainly not recommend anybody doing that, any of that with the COVID party. But the whole idea was that in a neighborhood, whenever any kid would get chickenpox, apparently they would send all the other kids to that kid's home. With the whole idea that the children will also contract chickenpox. Now, why would they do that thing? The whole idea there was because chickenpox is risky, right? But the whole idea there was that chickenpox is less risky, much less risky if you get it as a child, 5 year, 7-year-old. But it could actually be even fatal if you get it as a grown-up adult there. So it was, the whole idea was that you might as well get it sooner than later, and what better way to develop a lifelong immunity against chickenpox than to get it at that stage of life. Now, will you say it is a risk-free? It is not risk-free, but compared to what it could be if you don't contract chickenpox, this is much lesser risky thing. So that's why I'm saying, I think sometimes it really helps us to say, oh, I've never done that, it is very risky. But then if you're able to distill it down into something and say, hey, why don't we do that? Because it looks risky, but it's actually going to build some resistance or resilience that will be helpful in the long run when something goes wrong there, right? And proactively seek the problem. Sometimes we run away from the problem till we say, hey, this is not broken, why don't we do that? So I'll talk about one specific thing that Honda does in proactively seeking the problems in another slide from now. Building redundancy is another way to do that. I think this is another thing where I am little critical of the whole lean way of thinking. Now, what lean has done is it has created a lot of very lean or efficient supply chains or value chains or value stream, if you will, when we have depleted all the buffers. We don't have any kind of cushions available there. So what happens when you don't have any cushion? Everything is bumper to bumper, and if something goes wrong, for example, almost 28% of the manufacturing was happening in China. Now, because of COVID, there was a major disruption to the supply chains. When you have such kind of a single source dependency, then you get into a situation where there's nothing you can do in the short run, because everything has a supply chain that is ending somewhere in China, which is impacted because of COVID. So until the situation clears, there's nothing you can do about it. So on the other end, if you keep your options, if you have some buffer, if you build something so that you are able to absorb some amount of shocks, and then hopefully meanwhile you are able to build some redundancy in the system, that might be a far better way to look at it in terms of being anti-fragile, rather than collapsing simply because one of the link was so efficient that you could not find anybody and the entire value chain just collapses there. So starting with making time, a lot of us have such a busy time that everybody is running into 16-hour days and 18-hour days, and we are working so hard. Guess what? Whether you are an individual or an organization, if you don't have any capacity, in fact, that's one of the things I talk to teams when I tell them that, hey, when you are doing a sprint, for example, how many stories do you take it? Do you take it to fill up 100% of the time available to you, or more or less or whatever? A lot of teams think that they need to take 100% of the time. Now, guess what? When you have 100% of your capacity filled up, if there is a great idea or an interesting idea, or even if something new that you want to experiment, you don't have time to do that. You cannot even learn something new there. So there is no redundancy left in the system, and if there is any kind of a delay because of spillover or something, then you have the whole downward cascading impact because of that. So I think it's a good idea to think of how you can build redundancies in your value chain there. Pursuing side project is a great idea because and we have seen examples of that. 3M was the original proponent of 15% time back in 40s and 50s. They started out this concept where everybody was allowed to pursue 15% of their time to do some innovation project. And some of those ideas, including Post-it, came out of some of those things. Google took the same idea and created a 20% time out of it, which they disbanded later on, but then they have apparently come up with so many creative ideas in that 20% time. So I think there is a merit in that, because there is very little downside to it, because if you fail, it's not really killing the company, but there is a huge upside in case you kind of succeed there. And then expanding your network, and rather than looking at it from a very narrow filter, we're basically looking at it very broad brush and kind of building it and saying, hey, this seems like an interesting thing, why don't we look something in that? So these would be some pointers to that. And these help us to develop some options, and these options are basically the ones that allow us, it's almost like the real options theory, that these are the options that we can exercise if we are looking at doing it by acquiring new capabilities there. Practice via negativa and barbell is something I'll talk about in this slide. So let me just talk about it. So practicing via negativa is something that Nicholas Taleb talks about in his book on antifragility. And what he basically says is that we always try to think of building a resiliency or strong system by adding things in that. So we say, hey, let's add something, let's add a backup planning, let's add something else so that the system becomes stronger, because that's the mental model that we all have. But he says actually that makes it weaker. The right way of doing it would be actually to subtract something out of it, because then whatever you are left with is something that you can make it stronger there. So I'll just give one example of that. So he says eliminate the noise, basically remove all the extra things and just focus on the core. Kick the ladder out is a very interesting paradigm or a mental model that Honda uses. And Mr. Honda, who founded the company, he had this whole thing about that suppose you have a team that is doing very well, and then there is a danger that they will shift into, gradually glide into the zone of complacency. They would basically do some disruption by themselves. Maybe they will take one individual and post that individual out of the team somewhere else. So now instead of 7 people, you are left with 6 people. So now you are suddenly forced by constraints to think of how are you going to reallocating the knowledge and activities, or how are you going to manage with 6 people instead of 7. So they call it as kick out the ladder in their parlance there. And I think it's a very powerful metaphor for basically making sure that you are subjecting system to a lot of shocks on an ongoing basis, so that resulting system is much more resilient and hopefully more anti-fragile than what it is. So that's, I think, one good way of looking at it. He also talks about some very interesting thing, a barbell, and a barbell is really the weight that you would use in a gym. And he actually, that's why pictorially I'm depicting that. And what he says is that just like a barbell, think of your investment on extreme sides. On one side, you have the investment where you want to play very safe, because there are a lot of negative black swans, right? So you want to make sure that, so for example, market volatility is a risk, let us assume, and you are worried about your money or your investment portfolio. So what you do, let's say you take 70% of your investment or 80% of your investment and you put them in the tax-free or government bonds, the risk-free bonds, right? The risk-free bonds are assured of 5, 7, 8% there. Whether the market goes up or market comes down, you are assured of it. And because these are sovereign bonds or government treasury bonds, nothing is going to happen. Your money is not going to vaporize, right? So that's what a financial analyst, a good one, will tell you, that you park your money and it is safe. Now, what do you do with the remaining 20%? The downside is you have already reduced by 80% of your investment locked down there. So now you say, I'm going to put them in the high risk investment, because anything is only an upside for me. I mean, how much can this go down further? It cannot go down further, and even if it goes down, my balanced portfolio will take care of it. But if there is an upside, then that becomes the next stock there, and then I make 10,000 time gains or 5,000 time gains or whatever there. So that is what he calls as the barbell strategy, that you minimize or lock down your negative exposure, but your positive risk or a positive exposure, you try to maximize it by some kind of a allocation of your resources. The thinking is important. You might, as a company, have 10 projects in 10 different areas, and you might want to think of how can you really build your innovation portfolio in some of these areas. There is a concept that has been around in the US and the UK defense forces. They call it as red teaming. And red teaming is a concept that has also picked up a lot in the infosec, for example, or network security and other things, where people basically talk about how do you actively and proactively kind of attack your plans in order to see the vulnerabilities in them. Some people might also be familiar with things like pre-mortem, for example, which actually gives that kind of a thing. So that's a great way to start looking at it and saying, hey, these could be the areas that are causing it fragility. Let's eliminate them. So via negativa is also the principle you apply to once you have identified the vulnerabilities, you are kind of removing them from the system so that you are able to constantly keep improving the system itself. Some specific examples, for example, this was an article on McKinsey that talked about how you rethink the customer journeys. A lot of times we really think of it and say, hey, this is how the world has, for example, gone to a restaurant for last 400 years. Let's just continue the same thing. Even though we are bringing a digitalization in a digital business model, we are not fundamentally looking at the risk profile and saying, how do we really change the risk profile of that. So for example, in a COVID time, we are saying, hey, what areas might have a higher risk profile? And then we are proactively looking at, well, what can we do there to mitigate some of the shocks from the impact of the shocks that might be there. Automation is something that goes without saying. I'm sure all of us understand, but there has never been more need in the history to basically look at automation. 84% of the companies are accelerating automation. So I think that's like a given, in my view, a table stake there. Thinking of the organization or your business model as a complex adaptive system is also a great idea. And then when we look at the complex system perspective, we talk about things that instead of fail safe, we start talking of things which we call a safe to fail approach there. And a safe to fail approach is a great idea where I think it's very similar to the barbell strategy, where if you fail, you're not losing a lot of things. I mean, nobody's going to lose their shirt, or no company is going to go down. But if it comes up, then it's a great upside of the whole thing there. And that's the whole idea of a safe to fail approach there. And that could improve your anti-fragility of the system by proactively looking at areas where you can bring those opportunities there. I think shipping often is obviously something that we all understand there, because the more you ship, the more you're repeatedly subjected. And my perspective is that repeated success could lead to failure, because that's exactly the Thanksgiving turkey kind of a scenario that I talked about. But repeated failures could improve the odds of success, because you are systematically going around and figuring out what are your weak links, and then you are kind of building on top of that, right? And introducing shocks is that strategy, and Netflix strategy of chaos monkeys is, I think, a very particular case in point, where they have built this chaos monkey, and now they are calling it as a complete simian army, because they have a latency monkey, and they have a conformity monkey, and they have a doctor monkey, and they even have a security monkey and a chaos gorilla. Everybody is kind of attacking those systems with so many shocks that the resulting system is going to become much stronger, and it has the ability to actually benefit from those shocks, because everything is a learning experience from them as a business there. Just last few points on that. Recently, Zinnov did one event on Confluence. They do the annual conference, and Pari talked about how the global centers of excellence have really coped up in India. And I think it's very heartening to see that there is a lot of anti-fragility that has been displayed by the global centers of excellence, because from March until now, most of, like 93% GCOEs report that there is no negative impact on productivity. I mean, for years we have struggled with the whole idea that people work from home is a challenge technologically, socially, behaviorally, management control wise, but suddenly, without any forewarning or any preparation, suddenly all of us were locked down into work from home. And if 93% companies said there is no impact on productivity, I think that's a big deal there. In fact, the only thing I hear all these days is that there is a danger of people burning out because people are spending more time, and I think that's a bigger issue for all of us, right? Even engagement wise, 70% of them report there is no negative impact on the employee NPS. So I think it's all going well there. And he has also talked about what could an anti-fragile global centers of excellence look like there. So there is a model there. I would encourage you guys to check out his article, blog, and look at his thing there. So lastly, if I have to add there, if the key point I want to bring here is also looking, I talked about complexity. So what is a complexity mindset and how can it really help us? I think first thing that we need to understand and accept is that there is a complexity in the system and we need to deal with it differently. By just making the same logic and saying, let's add more and let's make it more stronger, let's make it more robust, is not going to solve the problem. This is because the fundamental nature of the beast itself, it is, we have to think of it like a Hulk. No, so that's a great analogy of Superman versus Hulk. A Superman is resilient model, right? Because a Superman can fight against anything. You throw more weight at Superman, Superman will bring the Boeing out of it alive, right? But Hulk is something that you subject any stress to, that it grows bigger, it grows bigger and stronger, and it's actually anti-fragile in that sense. So while it's good to be Superman, what we are really talking about is becoming the Hulk, because the Hulk is actually able to kind of deal and benefit from those, and you have to have a different mindset to deal with that. So it's also a complexity mindset, which is a very creative mindset. You are focusing on what it can be rather than what it is. So you're looking at it and saying, hey, oh, this is an opportunity for us. System went down. What can we do? What are the opportunities? How can we, like, look at this particular conference itself, right? 4 months back, when we had to think of an event or a conference, Ashwini would have to go, okay, I have to look for a hotel, I have to look for this thing, I have to look for that, I have to look for whether it should be in Whitefield, whether it should be here, and then all kind of a thing. And suddenly COVID came as a big impact, right? A shock there. Now it seemed to be that the whole model has collapsed there. How will we do that? But eventually new models are coming out, and we have become anti-fragile to the extent that now I'm sure there are people from all over the world on this call as of now, and I'm sitting at home and I'm able to do that, and you are sitting at home and you are able to do that. So we have displayed already a level of anti-fragility by being able to not look at it as a fragile way of doing, but we are kind of anti-fragile, and that comes only with the creative mindset of what can we do in this situation, as opposed to saying, oh no, we cannot do a conference because social distancing doesn't allow us to do an event there, and so on and so forth. So I hope you get the point of view there. We must remember complexity is not going to go away. It is just going to, that's the second law of thermodynamics. It is going to, complexity increases with time. That is the arrow of time. It is always going to be like that. And finally, that complexity is not just a threat, it is actually an opportunity, because now you can actually think of ways in which you were never able to do that. I mean, other day we were having the PhD that I do at ISB, we were having a conversation with the first dean, Pramod Sinha, and he said, see, there was no way I could have ever done that with my busy schedules, come and address all you 3 batches there, but today because of technology I'm able to do that. So the same constraint that doesn't allow people to travel is now becoming the strength, because we are able to actually benefit from that shock there. But it's a mindset, because end of the day, and I want to close it with this now, is it is the same wind, actually it is the same factor, but when you are a candle and when you are a fire, you deal with it differently. If you are a candle, you basically get extinguished by that, because you say, oh my goodness, this was like a big deal and there was no way I could handle that. But when you are a fire, you are saying, wow, okay, the wind, let it, bring it on, and I'm going to grow stronger with more wind there. And that is the anti-fragility that we are talking about there. So I'll end here my talk, but I hope it was helpful to basically say how do we really look at some of these ideas from the world of anti-fragility. A lot of those ideas are basically principles. I'm not by any means giving you a playbook that says, hey, this is thou shalt do that way, but these are a bunch of ideas that you can actually look at and see where there's an opportunity to kind of to do that thing. So thanks again for bearing with me. I hope I have some time, Ashwini, but I'm happy to take some questions if there are. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, we could go 1 or 2 minutes or few.
I mean, if you want to ask any question, then you can unmute and ask, I guess.
Yes, you can unmute and ask. I think TV, as always, you have left us with more questions than answers. So that's why.
Then that means the session was successful.
Exactly. So I do see, I mean, few chats on useful and always pleasant to hear.
So
And in
Tathagat,
fact, Sorry.
I just want to ask one question.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
with the last point which you discussed is one of the good point, and we usually don't see in general practice. So when a complex situation comes and people have to deal with complexity mindsets, so most of the time it is influenced from the top to bottom and as well as peer to peer. So at that time, how to deal with in a team level environment, how to deal with such situations.
Yeah, so see again, I mean, complexity mindset is not something that we can just do a local displacement and kind of expect the whole system to become to start behaving. It is obviously a very systematic mindset change because we are talking about a different kind of an org environment. I'm talking in the context of our work days. Instead of being a command and control that somebody is giving a top-down superimposed order, we are building it as some kind of a decentralized where the whole thing is an emergent order. It's a very different kind of a thinking there. We cannot do that. So obviously those ideas will need to basically it's a change management issue. There are companies, and I would encourage you to look at companies that have basically gone. There are some models like holacracy that talk about it, which systematically dismantle the titles and hierarchy and do that. And if you go through holacracy and Brian Robertson's book and the whole model, he actually asks the CEO to actually sign on the constitution. Because he believes that unless the systematic top-down change happens, it is not going to happen. Another favorite model of mine is the beyond budgeting, which has been around for about 50 years now. And beyond budgeting is actually an organizational model that encourages a complex adaptive system kind of a thinking without saying it in that many words, because it's a top down delayering process. That also has to happen from top there, because top is the one which has created that power structure to begin with. So you cannot expect to dismantle it without the say and the buy-in of the top leadership there. So I would certainly expect that all of us are learning more about it, bringing those ideas. Maybe I'm a project manager and maybe in my team there is an opportunity I see. Can I build some ideas there and then kind of grow from there? So no easy answers for you, Kamal. Sorry about that, but I think those are what I would respond with.
No worries, it is a good point to discuss it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, TV. That was a nice session. As a Cyberman team, I mean, this was I mean, for the entire Cyberman team, this was the only session where all of us could attend. And I'm seeing
Okay.
already on my WhatsApp pings that, okay, this is the great end for our day as well. Thanks a lot for that.
Hey, sure. Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Yeah,
Ashwini. And thanks a lot. Yeah.
yeah.